Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at the brain models and the spinal cord models for the review of the central nervous system. So let's go ahead and get started with the brain anatomy. So brain is made up of the largest part of the brain, I should say, which is 80% of your brain is your cerebrum. And the cerebrum has five main lobes, four that are visible to us, which is the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And on the inferior aspect of the brain, you have the second structure called the cerebellum. Going forward, if you take a look, the line that is separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe is the line that you see right here called the central sulcus. The area immediately in front of the central sulcus called the precentral gyrus, and the area immediately right after the central sulcus is called postcentral gyrus. You have another sulcus that is separating the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe, and this sulcus is referred to as the lateral sulcus. If you look at the brain from the superior view, you can see the line that is dividing the brain to two hemispheres, and this line is referred to as the longitudinal fissure. And again, you can also still see the frontal, parietal, and occipital lobe. You also can see clearly the line that is separating the frontal from the parietal lobe I talked about earlier, which is the central sulcus. If I take a look at inside the brain, again, kind of orienting you first, here is the frontal lobe, here is the parietal lobe, here is the occipital lobe. You cannot see the temporal lobe in this view because it's on the other side of the model. The internal structures that we have, starting with diencephalon, we have the thalamus. The thalamus is this oval-shaped structure, which is basically the gateway to your cerebral cortex. Right inferior to your thalamus, you have your hypothalamus, which is the structure right here. And coming off of the hypothalamus, you have the pituitary gland, which is part of the endocrine system. Now, close to or within proximity of your hypothalamus, you have your optic nerve. So optic nerve is a cranial nerve that basically originates from your eye, and it's an area right underneath that where the hypothalamus is where the optic nerves actually crisscross. Remember the whole concept of contralateral? So this is what happens. Basically, if you imagine the two eyes, so here are the two eyes, basically. If you kind of looking at the signal coming off the back of the two optic nerves, or the back of the eyes as optic nerve. So this is your optic nerve. Now again, the signal coming from the right eye needs to go to the left cerebral cortex and vice versa. So the region where that crossing happens is your optic chiasm, which is depicted as the structure right here. Now, we also learned that if you want to allow the two cerebral hemispheres to communicate with each other, you do need a nerve bridge. That's basically nerves that are extending from the right hemisphere to the left and vice versa. And this structure forms something called the corpus callosum. Now, we also have the midbrain structure, pons, which is that kind of bulging structure right here, and medulla oblongata. If you guys recall, these three combined together form the structure we identify as your brain stem. And if you continue farther down, this portion would become your spinal cord. Now again, kind of helping you remember some of the terminology. Again, this oval-shaped structure is your thalamus. Here is your hypothalamus. And here's the optic chiasm, and the extension off of that one is the optic nerve. We also have, as part of the hypothalamus, this is a structure called the mammillary body, which is responsible for acting as a relay station for your sense of a smell. We have this structure in the posterior aspect of the brain called the pineal body or pineal gland. which is involved in the sleep-wake cycle with the help of the hypothalamus. We have this red section called the choroid plexus, and right above that we have the fornix. Now, within your brain and around your brain, there is a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. If it's around the brain and the spinal cord, it flows in a layer called within a space, called subarachnoid space, which is between the two layers of meninges. However, if it's inside your brain, it runs inside the ventricles. So depictions of these ventricles, which are basically cavities, it starts with the lateral ventricle right here. Third ventricle runs within the space of your thalamus between the two hemispheres. This opening you see right at the center, this is your cerebral aqueduct, which transfers the CSF or cerebrospinal fluid from the third ventricle down to this little triangular structure you see, which is your fourth ventricle. Here's a better depiction. So this horn-like structure, that's your lateral ventricle. The central body that basically covers your thalamus, that's your third ventricle. Going down right here, that extension is your cerebral aqueduct, and then fourth ventricle is located right here. If you were again to look at the continuation of this, this continues down through the spinal cord at a cavity called the central canal. And I'll show you guys this on the next picture. So looking at some of the labeling again, the inferior part of the brain is your cerebellum. The white matter creates a pattern inside the cerebellum that looks like branches of trees. So we refer to these as arbor vitae. We also have folds on the surface of the cerebrum, which is kind of depicted as this specific pattern on the cerebellum. I apologize, keep saying cerebrum. These are called folia. Again, these are folds on the surface. Now, going back to your midbrain, which is this part, midbrain has two structures, which we have talked about it in lecture. We have the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi together form what we identify as corpora quadrigemina. It's a good review for you guys to remember that the superior colliculi was involved in visual reflexes and inferior colliculi was involved in auditory reflexes. Looking underneath the brain, so kind of orienting you guys again, this is the frontal lobe, and this is basically underneath the brain. And right here on either side, that's your temporal lobe. Now, if you can imagine, your nose would be right here, basically sticking out of the computer. So the signals gets sent from your nose and first reach this kind of enlarged structure right here, which has a specialized neurons for the sense of the smell or olfactory sense. Now, this enlargement is referred to as the olfactory bulb, which continues going down further into the brain through what we identify as olfactory tract. Looking at some of the structures of the spinal cord, which is still part of the central nervous system. Again, first thing I want to do is to be able to establish which side is the frontal, which side is the anterior, which side is the posterior aspect of the spinal cord. So what we look for is this line versus this wide opening. If you have an opening, this is referred to as the fissure, and it's marked the anterior aspect of the spinal cord. And if it's a single line, that's basically marking the posterior aspect of the spinal cord. So if it's a wide opening, again, kind of like what we discussed for the brain, if it's a big wide opening like your longitudinal fissure, we refer to this as fissure. This is anterior median fissure, as in it's in front, right in the middle, and it's an opening. Versus it's a minor opening, so we're gonna use the word sulcus or shallow opening. It's in the back, so posterior, and it's still in the middle. Now that we know the front and back of the spinal cord, we can take a look at the gray matter versus the white matter. So if you look at the gray matter, which is again depicted as this darker color, you can see three parts to this. So we have the posterior, we have the lateral, and the anterior. We also have three parts for your white column. One right here, let's say one right here on the side, and one in the front. So the white matter of the spinal cord is referred to as the white column. So we have posterior white column, lateral white column, and anterior white column. In case of the gray matter, we have still the three parts, but we refer to these as gray horn or just horn. So we have posterior horn or posterior gray horn, lateral horn, and anterior horn. Now, the the spinal cord needs to be connected for the two hemispheres as well. So the extension that again bridges between these two halves is referred to as the great commissure. And right at the center of your great commissure, you have the opening. And this is the opening where the cerebrospinal fluid passes through. And we already identified that as your central canal in our earlier slide. Now the extensions or the nerve that comes off of your spinal cord, these are again identified as either dorsal nerve roots. If they're in the back, there are strictly sensory data. And then you have ventral nerve roots. Basically, they sit in front, and these are strictly motor neurons. And then you have this enlargement lateral to that, still in the back. It's called dorsal root ganglion. Now you guys recall, ganglions are basically the cell bodies or clusters of the cell bodies of the neurons that form a visible structure we call ganglia. Next, we learn about nerve plexus. There are 4 nerve plexus that help us create redundancy within our nervous system and basically ensures that if one nerve is damaged, you won't lose the control over that part of the body. So that redundancy is really important. So the detail that you guys need to know for the nerve plexus is that it is broken down to 4 major nerve plexus. One that is within the neck region called the cervical, one that is supplying the arm called brachial, one that is associated with the lower back called lumbar, and one that is associated with the sacrum called sacral. Now, there are main nerves that originate from each of these with very important functions in terms of motor capacity or motor actions, basically voluntary motor control. For the cervical, we have one nerve that is associated with the diaphragm, allowing or innervating your diaphragm, called the phrenic nerve. For the brachial plexus, which is up here, if you come down, there are 3 main nerves coming and basically innervating the forearm. We have the one that's run on the side of the radius, called the radial nerve, one that runs on the side of the ulna, called ulnar nerve, and one that runs right in the middle called the medial nerve. Originating from your lumbar region, one main nerve that is depicted here is a nerve that runs in the middle of the thigh, associated with the femur again, called the femoral nerve. And from the sacral region, you have the longest nerve in your body that comes and innervates your whole leg, basically, called the sciatic nerve. Coming off of the sacral, you also have a nerve called the obturator nerve, which again plays a role in innervation of the lower limbs. And the other nerve that you really need to know also is the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve, which is originating from the lumbar region as well. So know the name of the plexus, know the main nerves that I have circled for you guys for your exam. A few other nerves that you have, the nerve that's associated with the tibia called the tibial nerve, and the one that is associated with the knee area and coming down from the medial aspect of the leg called the saphenous nerve. Last, what we're going to take a look at is looking at the brain anatomy, looking at the dissected brain for a sheep. So what you see here is the view of the brain. What is being peeled off is basically one of the meninges layer. You also can see a clear lining on the surface of the brain. That's your pia mater. And basically this would be your arachnoid matter that's around the brain. Now, looking at this brain, this is the frontal lobe of the brain, and you can see that the cerebrum, which is basically what we're visualizing here, it's separated to its two hemispheres using the main line called the longitudinal fissure. Looking from underneath, you have the extensions right in front of the brain. Basically, these extensions are your olfactory bulb and olfactory tract, what we depicted in the previous picture for the humans. Going a little bit farther down, you have this area. So these little extensions right here and right here, these are your optic nerve. And again, imagine these two optic nerves are crossing over each other. So that point of cross is the optic chiasm. And then another nerve that you can visualize is right below, that's called the oculomotor nerve or cranial nerve number 3. There are the total of 12 pairs of nerves from your cranium, but again, we don't discuss them in detail for the sheep brain anatomy. Looking at the internal structures of the brain, so you have this region. Let me actually use my laser pointer. You have this region right here called the corpus callosum, which is again the nerve bridge between the two hemispheres. Right below that, you have your fornix. This area is your fornix. This kind of roundish structure right here, that's your thalamus. And right below that would be your hypothalamus. And if you guys recall again, in human, we had the pituitary gland right underneath the hypothalamus. And then you also have the optic chiasm, and then the extension, which is right here, optic nerve. You also have the brain stem, which is this part, made up of midbrain, the pons, which is bulging out, and then medulla oblongata. Here is your cerebellum. And again, the extension after medulla oblongata, which is this part right here, would be the spinal cord. So here's another depiction again, thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, optic chiasm. You don't see the extension for the optic nerve here. You also have right next to the thalamus, basically where your midbrain would be right here. You will have the pineal gland, which is also part of the diencephalon. If you recall, pineal body or pineal glands are essential in terms of the sleep and wake cycle. And you also have these two bulges in the back. This is also part of the midbrain. We learn about these as well, called the superior collicular and inferior colliculi. And together, that's called the corpora quadrigemina. We also showed the ventricles. So if you were doing this dissection, what you would see is you can actually put your probe and see or feel the cavity between the corpus callosum, which is the structure, and your fornix right here. So this cavity that opens up between these two structures is the lateral ventricle. Running on the surface of the thalamus, you have your third ventricle. Continuing down that, right here, there would be an opening again if you kind of separate your cerebellum from the pons region. Right here would be your cerebral aqueduct. And then you kind of can visualize a triangular structure right here. This triangular structure right here would be your fourth ventricle. So that's about it for our brain and spinal cord anatomy. Please make sure again, go to your Canvas and complete the lab assignment for this unit.